Of all of the gross injustices of the Jim Crow era, lynchings were the worst aspect of this historical period. Killing someone for the color of their skin became a common tragedy and horrifying reality of the Jim Crow South. Emmett Till's lynching was one of many murders, but his mother Mamie Till's choice to allow the world to see what was done to her son exposed the deep racism of America and sparked the beginning of the civil rights movement by calling attention to the great failures America brought to its people of color. One Mother's Stand, a movement begun. Mamie Till was born on November 23, 1921, in Webb, Mississippi. At the age of 2, she and her family moved to Argo, Illinois. Her family was part of a very tight-knit African-American community. Mamie's parents divorced when she was 13 years old, and it was very hard on her. However, she found solace in throwing herself into her schoolwork. Through her dedication and hard work, she graduated as one of only 4 African-American students to receive their diploma and the first African-American student to make the honor roll in the history of her predominantly white high school. At the age of 18, Mamie met and married Louis Till. Emmett was born 9 months later, and Mamie nicknamed him Bobo. In 1942, Mamie and Louis separated due to abuse and Louis's affairs, and he enlisted in the army and she never saw him again. Following the separation, Mamie and Emmett moved to Chicago's South Side. Emmett was very close to his mother and grandmother. At the age of 5, he developed polio but fully recovered. Other than that, Emmett had a happy and healthy childhood. His friends and community remembered him as a fun-loving and endearing child who spoke with a slight stutter. During the summer of 1955, when Emmett was 14 years old, Mamie wanted to visit friends and relatives in Nebraska, but Emmett asked if he could go spend the end of his summer in Mississippi instead to visit his cousins. With her family coming from the Deep South, she knew of the horrors black people faced. However, coming from Chicago, Emmett had no idea. She warned him to be very careful and to humble himself to the extent of getting down on his knees. Unfortunately, when Emmett boarded the train to Mississippi, that would be the last time Mamie saw her son alive. One day, Emmett and 7 others, who were all African American as well, went to a store owned by Carolyn Holloway Bryant and her husband Roy Bryant. While messing around with his friends outside of the store, he began bragging that he had a white girlfriend back in Chicago. His friends then told him that there was a beautiful white woman in the store and dared him to go talk to her. He proceeded to enter the store and supposedly flirted or made a sexual advance at Carolyn, whistled at her, and said "bye baby" as he walked out. Unfortunately, the actual events that occurred inside of the store were never corroborated because there were no other witnesses. However, his alleged actions led to his gruesome lynching solely for the color of his skin. Word of Emmett's alleged actions quickly spread through the town, and a few days later, when Carolyn's husband Roy returned from a business trip, he and his brother-in-law, J.W. Millam, hunted Emmett down. He was staying with his great-uncle, Mose Wright. Millam and Bryant were armed when they arrived at Wright's house one night and demanded to see Emmett. His great-uncle showed them to the room he was sleeping in, and they forced him to get dressed and come with them, despite the pleas of Wright and his wife. Millam and Bryant originally had planned on just beating Emmett, but his insistence that he was no different than the two of them kept him from being scared, so they felt the need to take things further. After already beating him senselessly, they found a cotton gin fan to use as a weight, forced Emmett to strip naked, shot him in the head, and then pushed him into 20 feet of water. 3 days later, some fishermen discovered his feet floating, and the world would come to see the complete mutilation of his body. Authorities wanted to bury Emmett's body quickly, but Mamie requested that the body be sent back to Chicago. Mamie knew that the world had to see what had been done to her son, so she chose to have an open casket funeral. "I wanted the world to see what they did to my baby," she said.
Funeral home, about 3 blocks away, an odor met me that nearly knocked me out. I said, "What on earth in the world is that?" It was Emmett's body. My father was on one side of me, and Rayfield Moody was on the other side of me, and Jean was at my back. And I shrugged them. I said, "Turn me loose. I've got a job to do, and I don't have time to be fainting now." I saw his tongue had been choked out and it was lying down on his chin. I saw that this eye was out and it was lying about midway the cheek. I looked at this eye and it was gone. I looked at the bridge of his nose and it looked like someone had taken a meat chopper and chopped it. And I looked at his teeth because I took so much pride in his teeth. His teeth were the prettiest things I'd ever seen in my life, I thought. And I only saw two. Where are the rest of them? They'd just been knocked out. And I was looking at his ears. His ears were like mine. They curled. They're not attached, and they curled up. The same way mine are. And I didn't see the ear. Where's the ear? And that's when I discovered a hole about here, and I could see daylight on the other side. I said, now, was it necessary to shoot it? If that's a bullet hole, was that necessary? And I also discovered that they had taken an axe and they had gone straight down across his head, and the face and the back of the head were separate.
Milam and Bryant were both acquitted of all charges by an all-white jury, further showing the institutionalized racism embedded into the Deep South culture. Mamie hoped that they would at least be convicted for kidnapping, but received no help from any government official at any level to bring these charges forward. In a newspaper interview after their acquittal, both Milam and Bryant gave a full detailed confession of their crimes against Emmett Till. The injustice of his death was even greater. The most immediate effect of the open casket funeral was the spread of the photographs of Emmett's body. An article was published in Jet, an African-American magazine, which then brought national outcry in African-American communities everywhere. Mamie Till's decision to have an open casket funeral conveyed the extremes of racism to the world, especially to people who had no idea how polarized race relations were in the South. Emmett Till's lynching became a rallying cry for change amongst people of color everywhere. The most important effect of Mamie's actions was the inspiration it gave to civil rights leaders. Emmett Till's lynching became a symbol for the incredible danger and lack of rights and protections African Americans faced, and how necessary true change was. Mamie's courage in sharing her grief for her son's short life specifically inspired Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., two of the movement's greatest leaders. Taking a stand in history can take many forms. In Mamie Till's case, her stand was unprecedented in Jim Crow times, a mother demanding justice for her dead lynched child. Her insistence that her son not be forgotten, yet another black life lost, gave leaders of the civil rights movement the strength to fight the established race regime of Jim Crow. They marched, they staged sit-ins and peaceful demonstrations, they boycotted businesses and demanded service at restaurants, and they did not go to the back of the bus. The movement did not stop until ultimately the Civil Rights Act passed and African Americans had legitimate political rights in the United States for the first time. Emmett Till died at the tender age of 14 from horrific, cruel, and unimaginable torture at the hands of grown men who attacked him for nothing more than the color of his skin. Emmett's lynching showed the world the terrible extent that white Americans would go in the Jim Crow era to prevent African Americans from having any rights, a voice, a say, or even a life. It was Mamie Till's courageous decision to have an open casket funeral that exposed the jarring injustice of the harsh reality of African American life in Jim Crow America. One mother's stand, a movement begun.